but the clock being our enemy, I'd like to just very briefly introduce our second speaker in this session, Barbara Hussey, who's very well known for work as a solicitor in the world of family law, but it's on something that's much more germane to our theme today, to talk about her late husband, and if you like, to bring further our thoughts about communication and innovation in the mid and late 20th century. But Barbara, all yours.
So, I want to thank Senan Healy and the staff in the RDS Library and Archives for inviting me here today to speak. I'm a great admirer of both the RDS, which plays a very important part in the life of Dublin, providing a fantastic venue for a range of events, and also of the library, which is a great resource for the researching public, I've checked. And it seems to me to be a terrific idea to promote the use of its archives and to promote historical research. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to recall some of the work Justin Keating did and some of the ideas he developed over his lifetime. But first, an admission. I know very little about the history of Irish agriculture. I did learn this morning, but when I was writing this, I knew very little about it. And I don't come from a farming background. So what am I doing here? The late Justin Keating was my husband, and in the mid-1960s, he was appointed head of agricultural broadcasting and adult education in Radio Telefís Éireann. And between 1965 and 1967, he presented a program called Telefís Ferma, which was a farm school on television, filmed in black and white. The reason I know about the program is that he wrote about it in his notebooks. I think I did watch some of the series in the 1960s, when I was still at school. But before you get alarmed, let me reassure you that I was Justin's second wife, and we only got together in the 1990s. Given my lack of knowledge of the history of Irish agriculture, I should tell you where the ideas for my paper come from. After Justin died in 2009, I found his handwritten notebooks, and I started reading them. There were 8 of them in all, and I wasn't sure what to do with them. He had toyed with the idea of publishing them, but sadly, he died suddenly before he'd finished writing them, and he left us with no guidance about what should happen to them. Using speech dictation software, I read them aloud and sent them to the Keating family. And to cut a long story short, they've now been edited, and I'm delighted to tell you they are going to be published by Lilliput Press in March next year. The book is called Nothing is Written in Stone, The Notebooks of Justin Keating. And it's from Justin's book that I have put together my paper today. The main theme in the book is that we need to continuously revise and rework the system of ideas we've inherited. He called that reworking our paradigm. In fact, I thought of using that as the title for my paper here today, but I decided that the phrase, "if you show me better, then I must change," which was a phrase he liked to use, probably conveyed the idea equally well. So, today I'd like to discuss some of the themes in the book relating to Justin's farming days, namely Telefís Ferma, cows, and soil. So who was Justin Keating? There's a picture there. Now, those of you who remember Telefís Ferma would remember a Justin Keating without his beard. But that's the same man. He was born in Dublin in 1930, the second son of the painter Sean Keating and May, née Walsh, who was a political activist. She had spent her childhood in Spain, and on her return to Ireland was very involved in the anti-Franco movement here. Justin grew up first in Killikee and later in Ballyboden, Rathfarnham, where he met and became intrigued by the bohemian and left political circle of his parents. Now, I need to read the next section. The man I fell in love with in the early 1990s was many things. An academic vet, dean of the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine in UCD for a short while, a feminist, a farmer who for a time was a communist. He later became a Labour Party TD, then Minister for Industry and Commerce in the Fine Gael Labour Coalition government 1973 to 77. He was elected a senator from the agricultural panel after he lost his seat in the Dáil. For a brief time, he was an MEP. He was president of the Humanist Association from 1998 until his death. And one of the last roles he held was adjunct professor of equine science in the University of Limerick. But back to Telefish Ferma. Exciting things happened in the early days of Telefish Éireann, which was launched in 1961. For instance, on one occasion, Justin got a carpenter to make an outline of a U in plywood, to paint it, cut the relevant shape out of her flank, and put in a cardboard womb. And finally, Justin inserted a lamb. Not a real one. It was made of foam, plastic, and wire, so it could be bent in all directions. On camera, Justin manipulated the lamb into the various positions that occur in lambing. Normal first, then one leg backwards, then the head and neck, and Justin delivered the lamb each time after correcting the positions. For the time, this was sensational television, really innovative, and it caused a stir. Even prudes couldn't object. The lamb was made of plywood and was a doll. The late Gerrit van Gelderen produced wonderful animated graphics for Telefish Ferma, and he worked behind the set, making things moved. And in the book, Justin described how the studio floor in RTE was littered with actual living or inanimate agricultural objects with which he interacted during the programme. According to Brendan Halligan, Justin's Labour Party colleague, within a year, Justin had become a household name throughout the country. He was a skilled communicator who, as a university lecturer, learned early on how to engage with and hold his audience. Pity, you might say, that I never took lessons from him. The controller of programmes in RTE at the time was a Swede called Gunnar Rugheimer, and he saw the opportunity to modernise Irish farming. He threw his weight behind using television to do this, and I think great credit is due to Telefish Éireann for having had the foresight to make Telefish Ferma and to put it on prime time television for 48 programmes over 2 years. It was the world's first agricultural school on television and won a Jacobs Award, as well as the Ear of Corn International Agricultural Film Award in 1968. In the mid-1960s, not every home had a television set. So viewing groups had to be organised all over the country in village halls where the young farmers could watch Telefish Ferma. The Farmers' Journal offered financial assistance so that the groups could rent television sets. And also they carried short group notes each week in the paper ahead of the programme, which Justin had written. This support from the paper was hugely important, and I want to pay tribute to the journal and to Matt Dempsey for their contribution. Macra na Ferma, the Irish Farmers Association, and Muintir na Tíre, as well as the farm advisors employed by An Foras Talúntais, also came on board, and their participation contributed a great deal to the success of the programme. At the end of the first year, an exam was set for the farmers, and certificates were presented to those who passed. As an aside, I was unable to get much information when I tried to research about the number of viewing groups that there were, and also about the number of certificates that had issued to the students. Indeed, I was told at one point that no certificates had ever been issued on Telefís Feirme. So with the aid of Countrywide, the RTE radio programme, I managed to track down 2 of them, which were sent in to that programme by 2 very kind listeners. So I now appreciate the importance of good archive material. The mantra at the time was that for farmers to make money, they needed to intensify production, which meant they had to use plenty of man-made fertilizers and agricultural chemicals on their land. And that's what Justin taught the young farmers on Telefís Feirme. As he said in the book, more and more, up and up. He had learned that model, high input, high output, at university, and also from membership of the pioneering Grassland Association, and he practiced what he preached on his own farm. Later, he realized that that model, which was also put forward by the orthodox agricultural economists of the day, totally ignored externalities. What are they? An example of a negative externality, Justin cited in his book, is that if you use farm chemicals in a way that damages the water quality, you must clean it up before it is fit to drink, and that costs money. The damage is done by individual enterprises, farms or factories, whereas the cost is borne by the taxpayer, you and me. Farmers were partly to blame, Justin thought, but were not well organised, not prone to take a long or wide view, and were thus easy victims of sophisticated advertising. Justin argued that the villains were the industrialists, faithful to the bottom line and oblivious or indifferent to the consequences. Much later, Justin realised that what he had taught young farmers in the mid-1960s on Telefís Feirme was the wrong thing. So in his book, he acknowledged. He said, "The way that I advised people to farm nearly half a century ago contributed in its own proportionate way to making the earth uninhabitable. So I'm now utterly green." Turning to soil, as a working farmer, he loved his fields, and when he began to study about the soil, he realized what a delightful and entrancing thing it is. But on close inspection, he noticed that however much fertilizer he applied to it, his soil was deteriorating. It was getting shallower. That discovery was a major step in his ideological revolution. He felt it made complete nonsense of what passed for analysis of farm productivity by agricultural economists and others. He studied ecology and became greener and greener as he got older. One of the ways he put that was, and I quote, "While I'm not exclusively organic, I eat as much organic food and I drink as much organic wine as I can conveniently lay my hands on. I'm beginning to form the opinion that organic wine gives one less of a hangover than normal wine. I'm not sure," he said, "but I'm continuing my research." 2 books in particular influenced him. One was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and the other Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher. But emotionally, there was another catalyst for his change. He was farming in Ballymore Eustace and had built a state-of-the-art herringbone milking parlour designed for his cows. In pursuit of cleaner milk, he noticed that his diligent farm manager had not just clipped the long hairs on the end of the cows' tails. He had amputated the end of the tails themselves. It was the done thing, but according to Justin, it was a road to Damascus moment. It convinced him that it was not permissible to relate to beautiful creatures like his cows in that way. Writing about the care of the earth, he thought the whole morality of how we relate to nature needed revision. It's not for us. We are part of a whole, balanced, long-evolved, dynamic ecological system. And he argued, we can use our intelligence to have a symbiotic, cooperative relationship with the rest of it, or we can become parasitic, which he feared we had done. We needed, he said, for our own well-being and that of the earth, to cooperate with and cease to try to dominate the environment. Otherwise, in his opinion, our species was in danger of destroying the planet. When he died on the last day of December 2009, Justin was buried in a cardboard coffin. He didn't want to be cremated, he said, because he thought that consumed too many calories, and to the end, he wanted his footprint on the earth to be as light as possible. Apart from agriculture, there is one other area in which Justin developed and changed his thinking, which I'd like to speak about briefly before I finish. I think it's relevant given what's going on between Ireland and the European Commission at the moment. In 1972, Justin and Garrett Fitzgerald toured Ireland, campaigning on opposite sides of the argument in the referendum on entry into the European Economic Community, as it was then called. The Labour Party at that time was against entry, and Justin was appointed their spokesperson on Europe. He didn't have difficulty with this, even though Jack White of RTE said to him one day, "I can't understand why you are urging a no vote, because you're the most European person I know." They'd worked together on a television series called Into Europe, so Jack White was in a position to judge. Justin had studied the EEC carefully for that series and tried to present his programs, showing warts and all. He made 4 programs on location, which was a first for RTE in 1968. And the programs were in France, Belgium, Denmark, and Sweden. There were 2 reasons he felt able to campaign for a no vote in good conscience. One was because he thought the yes side was not telling the full truth by arguing that the common market was just a trading enterprise and wouldn't impact on our neutrality or our sovereignty. In his book, he stressed that he was not in agreement with the nationalists and others who preached chauvinism with the defense of the nation state, which was 100 years out of date and irrelevant, Justin thought. The second reason he opposed the yes side was that they argued that if Ireland failed to take the opportunity at entry in 1972, we wouldn't get the chance again. And while Justin disagreed, he thought it was important to have a real debate, and he was able to support the no side, given that he'd already studied the facts for the programme Into Europe. As we know, the electorate gave the yes side a huge victory, and in January 1973, Ireland joined the EEC, and shortly after that, Justin was one of the first Irish group to go to the European Parliament, having been nominated by the Oireachtas. He had another short stint in the Parliament in 1984. Although early on Justin had doubts and reservations about the European Union, as we now know it, he ended up a strong supporter of it, believing that Ireland had done really well in the negotiations which followed membership, helped enormously by the negotiating skill of a dedicated staff in the Department of Foreign Affairs. In Justin's opinion, they had secured for us perhaps even more than we deserved. He became not just pro-Europe, but a passionate federalist as well. He wanted the central institutions of the community to be big enough, strong and coherent enough to speak for all of us in circumstances where the nation state was seen to be pathetically impotent. Globalization, Justin argued, was here for good or ill. It was far advanced and irreversible. And he argued that we needed a larger federal Europe. He was a believer in continuous revolution. And just as I said at the start, he expressed the belief in nothing is written in stone, that each individual must, for as long as they live, keep demolishing and rebuilding their paradigm, that word again. He thought that a world changing at a much greater pace than ever before would find its institutions obsolete almost before they were established. So he called for continuous revolution in our institutions. And to quote him, he said, "Such changes don't proceed in a linear way. There's a long period of relative stagnation, and then, often in response to a crisis," he was actually writing about 2008, "things flip, and then change becomes possible in the face of a response to challenge." I wonder what he would think about the recent move by the European Commission concerning Apple. But then I realize I've often wondered what he would have made of world events since his death. I'd like to finish with a quote from Michael D. Higgins at Justin's funeral. He said of him that his was a life rich in the integration of science, nature, and society, delivered within a socialist vision that he saw as both essential and adaptable to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've had two very different but marvelously complementary papers in the last hour or so. And we have a few minutes for comments or questions to either of our speakers. Please.
I'd like to, Austin Meskel, I'd like to compliment both speakers. Matt referred in particular to the machinations of the Department of Agriculture, which the journal was happy to expose. And as one of the sinners, all of that he mentioned, I just make a slight little correction to one of the things you said, Matt. I do it so with the greatest deference, of course. And that was in relation to the Charolais importation in 1964, which was groundbreaking. It had been mooted for a number of years prior to that and could not be done because of our American boxed beef trade, which would have been totally jeopardized had we gone ahead because of foot and mouth on the continent from where we would be getting the Charolais. And you mentioned that the Charolais were imported and then we put up the quarantine station. The quarantine station came first.
It was before, yeah.
Yes.
I would agree, yeah.
And that was done totally under the supervision of the Americans. It had to be on an island, and it had to be virtually disease-proof and all the rest. So Very seldom, Matt, did I ever get the chance to correct you.
No, but
And I'm seizing on this.
no, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Austin.
Yeah. Any other comments? Just 1 second. Let's get the microphone. Yeah.
Why was the American in charge of checking, doing the quarantine? I'm very surprised because you were a nation, you were a republic at that time.
We had this very valuable trade, and we were one of the very few anywhere in the world who could export to America at the time because we had no foot and mouth. And if we took in cattle from the continent where there was vaccination, compulsory vaccination of all animals over 9 months, we ran the risk of losing that very, very valuable trade to the Americans. That's why we had to defer to them. And that's why the Charolais had to be, they were selected at about 4 months old because they had to go on quarantine, on-farm testing, quarantine on the continent, and then quarantine in Ireland, on Spike Island. And we were able to do it successfully because we convinced the Americans that we were doing it. And if the cattle, say, on Spike Island had reacted, they could have been all slaughtered and we wouldn't have jeopardized our trade. It was a tricky operation.
But if I can just interrupt, Austin, I mean, what you say is absolutely not just valid, but a really remarkable insight given your position at the time. But it's worth making the point that also, of course, we had a very valuable American trade to the forces in Frankfurt.
That is right, yes.
With very heavy Herefords slaughtered in Grand Canal Street and Leixlip. And again, I think, weren't we the only European country with access to that very valuable US forces market?
That's right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Herefords. They wanted animals with a good cover of fat.
Absolutely.
And of course, Herefords would provide that. There's no way they could get that from Charolais, which of course they could get on the doorstep in Europe, but they wouldn't have them. Okay, thanks.
Please.
Might I suggest that this is called pre-clearance for cattle? I also want to add my compliments to the two speakers. For me, the measure of the Farmers' Journal is that its circulation exceeds that of the Irish Times. I just want the audience to know that.
It only barely, I think, and only very recently.
One will do. And the second comment I want to make is simply to share a memory of your late husband. I was once asked to make a presentation at a meeting that he was chairing when he was in government on the report by Lord Kennett for the Commission on whether the bureaucracy in Brussels should have a Futures Institute. I can't remember the exact name, Future Studies Institute, Futurology Institute, I'm not sure. There was a marvellous discussion afterwards, and Justin was in the chair, but it didn't happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if we have no other comments, I would just invite you to thank our two speakers for, I mean, it's always difficult after lunch, but I think everybody was very much alert to those, and I suspect there are sort of questions that are going to come in an informal way. But before I hand back to Shannon, I'll just ask you to thank our two speakers.